Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for caring about this vital issue. My name is Dominique Browning, and I am the Senior Director and co-founder of a program inside of Environmental Defense Fund called Moms Clean Air Force. We have over 1 million members, moms, dads, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and we train people to go talk to their lawmakers about climate pollution and air pollution on behalf of our children's health. Scientists around the world are ringing alarm bells about global warming. We are now in a critical period. We have a window of opportunity to cut carbon and methane emissions to avoid triggering the very worst impacts of a hotter climate, impacts that we will not be able to control. Make no mistake, we are in it, it is happening, and there is a lot of trouble already baked into the system. Dangerous new hot zones are spreading around the world. The government reported that this July was the hottest month ever since record-keeping started in 1880. 3 of the hottest years on records occurred in 2015, 16, and 17. But rather than throw a lot of numbers at you, I'd like to tell you a story. I went this summer on a family vacation to Glacier National Park in Montana, a place I had always wanted to see. And we hiked over to Iceberg Lake, and I was so excited to see real icebergs in Montana. And I was there with my 2 sons, and after this very long and very hot hike, we got there, and the iceberg was the thinnest, saddest looking thing, the glacier, saddest looking thing. It was like looking at a dying beast. We all sat there and just sort of honored it and went back down, and there we found a sign from the National Park Service saying, at the rate of warming that we are seeing, the glaciers will be melting so rapidly that in 10 years there will be no more glaciers in Glacier National Park. And it struck me that my 3-year-old grandson will never see those glaciers in Glacier National Park. I had no cell service while I was there, and when I got out of the park, my phone started pinging with lots of news and a message from the airlines saying, we have canceled your flight to Salt Lake City because of a heat wave. The tarmac is too soft for the airplanes, and the air that is so hot is too heavy to give the plane lift. So just a small, every day, this is what life is going to be like and is like. This warmer planet is exposing us to more extreme weather violence, and that's what we need to start calling it. Longer and more dangerous heat waves, massive flooding, longer droughts, longer and hotter and wilder wildfire seasons. More intense heat means more air pollution, more toxic pollution, and more smog. A recent American Lung Association study found air quality has declined recently after years of steady improvement. We're seeing higher levels of soot and smog. Medical experts agree we are facing a global public health crisis. There's nothing healthy about a warming planet, one that is warming more and more rapidly. Air pollution can cause diabetes, stroke, lung cancer, chronic and acute respiratory disease, and heart disease, not diabetes, sorry. Dirty air is also associated with learning and behavioral problems, diabetes, and low birth weight. Rising temperatures and changes in precipitation are resulting in the spread of vector-borne diseases. In other words, mosquitoes, ticks, and fleas are spreading disease in an ever-growing pattern. Collectively, all of these risks are threatening to overwhelm our healthcare systems. The 1 million moms of Moms Clean Air Force and the several million moms of Environmental Defense Fund are beyond deeply concerned. This keeps us up at night. Children whose hearts beat faster and whose lungs work harder than those of adults are more vulnerable to the impacts of dirty air, and grandparents are more vulnerable too. We're compromising the safety of our world and that of our children and our children's children. We are squandering their futures. I spent most of my career in the magazine business, most recently at House and Garden, and I recognize some people from my magazine life. And sometimes I think it's an odd move to have gone from editing a magazine to being a climate activist. But in fact, what we thought about at House and Garden was how much we love our homes and how much comfort and safety we feel in our gardens. And I think about the planet that we are on, this gorgeous garden that we have, and we are increasingly feeling unsafe, and we should be. Our children are striking. Tomorrow is a global climate strike day. They are occupying offices on the Hill. Their mothers are going to Senate offices demanding action. People are protesting in the streets. We are telling our lawmakers, do something. Environmental Defense Fund is doing a lot, and thank you to all of you for your help and support. Tonight, we're going to talk about how we at EDF are working to protect the health of children and communities from climate change, and how we're fighting back against efforts by the Trump administration to roll back core environmental protections. We have two EDF experts with us. Dr. Elena Kraft, on the end, is the Senior Director of Climate and Health. Her groundbreaking scientific research helped sound the alarm after Hurricane Harvey that the people of Houston were being exposed to toxic air pollution. Also with us is EDF General Counsel Vicki Patton. She leads our U.S. Clean Air program. Over the past 2.5 years, her legal team has filed scores of court actions to defend bedrock American environmental protections that are now under attack. I'd like you to be involved in a conversation tonight, and I will invite you to ask questions. We will have mics to help us all hear each other. Tonight's discussion will be videotaped and made available to you and other EDF supporters, and we'll share that link with you in a few days. I'd like to start with Vicki, who is, as I said, EDF's General Counsel. She's also a co-founder of Moms Clean Air Force. I've had the privilege, Vicki, of working with you for almost a decade now, and every day I'm so grateful for your inspiration and deep wisdom and guidance. Vicki and I started out together fighting toxic mercury emissions coming from coal-fired power plants almost a decade ago. Pollution that harms the developing fetal brain. There is no amount of mercury that is safe. Who would fight for the right to pollute with mercury? We won that protection years ago, and now here we are again, fighting for them all over because the Trump EPA is trying to roll mercury protections back, and they are doing so much more. So Vicki, what's going on? You've been working on regulations for decades. You've seen so much. Is this an unusual time?
First, thank you so much, Dominique and Elena, for the great privilege of working with both of you. These are unprecedented threats. I've had the great opportunity to work to protect human health and the environment from harmful climate and air pollution for 30 years, and I've never experienced anything like this. We're fortunate in that we have this amazing bipartisan, vibrant law that is really like the crown jewel of environmental law called the Clean Air Act that is all about protecting all Americans from harmful air pollution. And it also places upon the Environmental Protection Agency not only the authority but the responsibility to address harmful climate pollution. The Trump administration is unfortunately working to tear down a number of really critical safeguards that are anchored in that bipartisan sort of crown jewel the Clean Air Act. Fortunately, it's hard to do. It's difficult for them to tear them down, and it's difficult because they're reckless with the facts, they're reckless with the law, and they're dismissive of the public. And judges get it, that whether you're a Republican-appointed judge or a Democratic-appointed judge, that the public is supposed to have basic rights that are protected. And so in cutting corners, the Trump administration has encountered major difficulties in pursuing these rollbacks. Just briefly, our focus, our tenacious, relentless, fearless, unyielding focus is on addressing the harmful climate and air pollution from the single largest polluting sources. And that's, as you indicated, it's the coal plants all across America that are required by law to limit their mercury and their arsenic and their acid gases. And indeed, they already have. The Trump administration's trying to pull that back. It's our nation's sort of landmark clean car standards that provide for really important, vital landmark protections in reducing climate pollution and other health-harming contaminants. And the Trump administration's trying to pull that back. It's the Clean Power Plan that is the first ever set of standards that limit harmful climate pollution from our nation's power plants, and that they are trying to kind of roll back. Its limits on the methane and the smog-forming contaminants and the cancer-causing benzene from oil and gas. And that methane from oil and gas is a potent climate forcer. It has a global warming potential that is 84 times that of carbon pollution. It's responsible for so much warming in addition to other localized health harms. They just recently proposed to tear that down and to pull that back. So at stake are measures, safeguards, that if they stay in place, they'll protect thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands of respiratory illnesses, hundreds of millions of tons of damaging climate pollution. And if they're successful in pulling them back, those protections, those safeguards will be lost. They're also threatening the science that underpins all of our core climate and health protections. And we are in there working with many partners to protect kind of that foundational science. And we're also working to hold the Trump administration accountable by shining a light on some of the corruption. And so we have this amazing group of attorneys who are enforcing our nation's open records law, so that we can sort of take a look at and not only sort of take the Trump administration to the court of law, but hold them accountable in the court of public opinion by showing that, William Happer, who just recently announced that he was going to resign from his post at the National Security Council, was directing senior officials at NOAA to change the NOAA's website and the harms it was describing from climate change. So, we are, and we're doing all of this, I just want to underscore, in partnership with many. There are state attorneys general who are on the front lines with us, health and medical groups like American Lung Association, American Public Health Association, that are tremendous, vital partners, and Moms Clean Air Force, which unites moms all across the country in the commitment to clean, healthy air for their children, no matter what perspective they have. Our goal is to protect our nation's bedrock environmental laws, to keep these policies on the books, and to ensure that, day one, at the earliest possible moment in a new administration, we can spring forward to protect human health and the environment from climate and air pollution. And we'll all have these bipartisan bedrock environmental laws to protect, millions of Americans for generations to come. That's our aim.
Polls show that the majority of Americans are increasingly concerned about global warming. And here's another story for you. The most notorious conservative pollster and marketer, Frank Luntz, he's the person who invented the term death tax for estate taxes, very cleverly. And he's the one who persuaded the Bush administration to never talk about global warming, but only to talk about climate change, because that sounded like something unthreatening, and it sounded like something that's always been going on. Frank Luntz, a couple of weeks ago, testified in Washington before a congressional committee on climate and said, "I was wrong. I made a mistake." And the reason he said he was wrong is that he was woken out of a deep sleep in his bed in California when fires began raging outside his home, and he got an evacuation notice. And he described elsewhere coughing and breathing in all this particulate pollution. And as he watched these flames coming closer and closer to his house, he thought, oh, this is really happening. And part of me is outraged that that's what it takes for somebody like him to engage, but another part of me says, okay, we will take that support, and that at least he stood up and said, I made a mistake. Somebody else who has been on the front lines of climate disaster is our Elena Kraft. And Elena is from Houston. And Elena, tell us about what happened there, because your experience was so illuminating. Houston is the energy capital of the US, and it's home to hundreds of petrochemical facilities that are vulnerable to catastrophic damage. They're not prepared for the hurricanes we're seeing. Tell us what happens when Hurricane Harvey hit and the lessons you drew out of that.
Well, first I just wanted to say how honored I am to be a part of this panel. Vicki and Dominique have been trailblazers, leaders in our country. They've been mentors to me, and I deeply appreciate and I'm grateful for the opportunity that I have in my day-to-day work to be side by side with them. It's amazing for me to see what they can do every day. And before I mention Houston, I just want to take a moment to recognize that there are 50 confirmed dead from Hurricane Dorian. There are another 2,500 who are missing. The UN has estimated that there are 76,000 people from the Bahamas who are now homeless. And, you know, these extreme floods, the droughts, the chaotic weather, they are taking a toll on our society as a whole. And they're taking the toll disproportionately on those who are not able to manage these stresses. The very young, the elderly, minorities, and disadvantaged communities. The very least equipped to manage. And in the last 3.5 years, there have been 52 separate billion-dollar weather climate disasters in this country. In the 20 years prior, there was an average of 6 per year. We're in unprecedented times. Every time a storm rips through a community, it deepens those inequalities and those disparities. Folks who may have been just getting by, living on the edge, but making it, are not making it anymore. And losing a car, for example, in Houston, this always strikes me, can be devastating. It's a method of getting to work. There were 500,000 cars that were destroyed as a result of Hurricane Harvey. Harvey was the largest storm event that our nation has ever seen. Houston flooded by more than 5 feet of water. Homes, Superfund sites, wastewater treatment plants, and petrochemical facilities were flooded. In the storm's wake, 6 million pounds of hazardous pollution was released into the air within a matter of a few days. Although Houston has an extensive air monitoring network system, the state had actually taken it down in advance of the storm to protect the instruments from weather damage. My initial take on that is I understand that you want to protect the instruments, but what about the people that the instruments are supposed to be protecting? And so we've been advocating for, if you are going to make a move like that, to have some sort of active air quality management system that can serve as sort of your plan B option in those cases. And we knew that that network was down, and because of our extensive work with the Google cars and monitoring air quality around the country, our work in Aliso Canyon in Southern California, we were actually able to dispatch an air quality monitoring team from California basically overnight. We measured high concentrations, literally the very first measurement we took. We were side by side with the city of Houston, measuring benzene in neighborhoods that were directly next to facilities that were damaged by the storm. So things like floating rooftops at the facilities that had essentially caved in, other storage tanks that had been damaged. And we alerted Texas officials, and we worked with major news outlets, Washington Post, New York Times, NPR, Morning Edition, to share the information. One of our scientists, Grace T. Lewis, had actually developed a database of toxic releases that was published as an interactive piece as part of that New York Times article. So we were there providing information that was literally in real time, and extremely valuable. It was something that the state was not able to do for the communities in Houston. We were able to do that quickly because we knew where to look for those kinds of things. We knew what facilities were vulnerable. We knew what facilities were vulnerable because of Vicki's work looking at the comments time and time again of some of what some of these facilities have submitted. For example, in terms of the rollbacks, we can identify facilities that are trying to take shortcuts that do not want to comply with some of the bedrock environmental protections that give us those public health benefits. And we coordinated with our partners, including at the city. We made decisions quickly, we took risks, but we got our mobile unit from California to Houston fast enough to make a difference. And I think the main point of all of this is that this is not just a Houston story or a Texas story. These grim stories are any community in America. We all live too close to a Superfund site. We're all vulnerable to the devastation that these weather-related events can bring to our communities that are exacerbated by climate pollution. And we all have loved ones that are susceptible to the pressures that environmental exposures can bring. The medical director of Harris County reminded me of a quote recently, statistics are people without the tears. And I think that captures the sense that I have of the crisis that is upon us.
Wow, that's a great quote. Those of you who have been in New York City as residents for a long time might remember the experience of coming home at the end of the day and wiping your window ledge free of black soot and not really thinking about that's what we are breathing. Elena's experience with benzene, with invisible pollutants, reminds me that what's happened in 40 years is on one hand, an enormous success story of cleaning pollution up under the Clean Air Act and with EPA, and on the other hand, lots of hidden pollution, pollution that we don't see, and sometimes we don't even smell. That takes us back to more of a state and a local level. Vicki, given that things are so paralyzed at the federal level, tell us a little bit about what's happening, because I know Moms is deeply engaged at state level.
There's, for all of the kind of rollbacks and threats to national policy, there is a tremendous response from the states, from local governments, and from the private sector. There are now 24 governors who are part of the U.S. Climate Alliance. That means these governors, Republican and Democrats alike, are committed to achieving the reductions that the U.S. Committed to as part of the Paris Global Climate Accord, and following up with policies to achieve those reductions. We are seeing, even in the face of these national rollbacks, that companies are remarkably raising their voices and saying, we disagree with the Trump administration's efforts to tear down these vital climate and clean air safeguards. Just a few examples. In the effort to tear down the limits on mercury and arsenic and acid gases, every single major power company in America objected. Every single one. The Edison Electric Institute, which is all of the nation's investor-owned utilities, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, all of the rural co-ops, American Public Power Association, all of the municipal power providers, across the board, united, said, we do not want you to repeal these. We do not want you, President Trump, to tear these down. That's really tremendous. At the same time, there are power companies that are springing forward. Just a couple of examples, and I want to touch on why that is the case. In December, one of the largest power companies in the country joined with Environmental Defense Fund and state and local leaders and announced a path-breaking commitment to complete decarbonization of its entire generation. This is not any power company. This is one of the single largest power companies that has assets in the heartland, in the Midwest, in Michigan, in Minnesota, and North Dakota, and South Dakota, in the Intermountain West, in New Mexico, and Colorado, and Texas. And they said, we can completely decarbonize by 2050, and we can achieve an 80% reduction in our carbon pollution by 2030. Yesterday, that company's called Xcel Energy, but yesterday, the American Electric Power Company followed up, and they said, okay, we can accelerate our reductions in climate pollution. They had committed to make reductions of 50% by 2030, one of the largest power companies in America. And they said, we can go deeper, faster. There are a number of co-ops that responded to Xcel's announcement, said, we can decarbonize too. And why is that happening? That's happening because in all parts of our country, wind power, large-scale solar, together with storage, is outcompeting new and existing fossil, whether it's coal or gas. And that's happening all across America. So at the same time that our national policies are moving in one direction, our state policies are moving forward. We're seeing sweeping changes and action and leadership in places like New York and Colorado and Virginia and North Carolina. And we're seeing private sector leadership that is transformative. Part of what we need to do is we need to kind of keep those risk signals on the system and keep raising our voices to call on the private sector to act and to lead, and to call on states to act and to lead. And it's happening, and that's an enormous source of hope. And those are building blocks to make transformative national progress. Just the moment we have the opportunity to move forward on a national scale.
Thank you, Vicki. Environmental Defense Fund is deeply involved in a bill that is being organized, has been written, and is now actively seeking sponsors on 100% clean energy by 2050 across all sectors. So it's not just the electricity and power sector, but it's the transportation sector and the agricultural sector. So yes, huge, enormous systemic change is necessary within a few decades in order to avert the worst of what is happening. But we are determined to stick to the fight and make progress here. I'd love to invite your questions about any or all of this, please. And do we have a mic? And will you give us your name as well? Thank you.
My name is Elizabeth Mooney, and I'm looking at all these disasters on these islands, Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, and whatever, and it seems to me like there's some sort of, always follow the money, because why are these people burning diesel when they've got nothing but wind and sand and sun? And it's all because there's some bonds or whatever that are outstanding or whatever is happening that's trapping them in adding to their own disaster. So my question is, you talk about the investor-owned utilities and the co-ops that are redoing their mix of energy. I'm wondering, are you working at all with some of these other countries? Because they really don't need, they have all the energy they need. They just need a way to use it. And they're not.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your question. Thank you so much for being here and caring. It means so much to all of us that you're here and you're engaged and helping to challenge us to think about these issues on a global scale. One of the big changes that's happened at EDF during the 21 years I've been very fortunate to work at Environmental Defense Fund is that we started looking at some of the problems we're trying to tackle, and we realized to really get our arms around them, to solve them, we need to work globally. So we have a team of people who are experts on clean energy who are working in Puerto Rico to help ensure that as it rebuilds and the aftermath of the tragic Hurricane Maria, that it does so in a way that is anchored in clean energy and resilient. And it's a big part of how we think about sort of both preparing and responding to the threats of climate change, that every new capital investment, right, that we make needs to be clean, and it needs to be resilient and account for the really serious threats of climate change. And so we are working in Puerto Rico today to try to do that, and other parts of the world, in China, which is one of the single largest sources of climate pollution in the world, where we are trying to design and carry out vital limits on climate pollution, and it's happening.
Yes. The mic is coming to you.
Yeah, my name is Peter Klosterman, and this is sort of a question that sprung up when Ms. Kraft was talking about Houston. So this is focused on Houston, but obviously this question comes up in different forms, a lot of places, and this has to do with the question of rebuilding. And I know there was a lot of discussion at the time of the hurricane that there was problems with the zoning laws and all these developments that are taking place in floodplains, and this was not a good idea. And I was just wondering how that has played out after the hurricane, and what kind of progress is being made to prevent problems.
Yeah, so I would say the biggest problem with the zoning law in Houston is that there isn't one. And so one of the biggest things is that you have facilities that are literally building right next to communities or expanding next to daycares or senior centers. And so and also the flood maps they have not been able to keep up with the record amount of rainfall that we've received as part of these severe weather storms. So if you look at the frequency of the 500-year floods, for example, in Houston, we've had, I think, 4 500-year floods in the last 10 years. And so what that means is that the flood maps that had been generated for the region are actually not that useful because they're not taking into account the increase in frequency, the increase in rainfall. One of the things that I think has been so important about all of these storms is the way that they're behaving so differently now. So you see them stall. Hurricane Harvey was not a big wind storm. It was a massive rain event because it just sat there. And the same we saw with Dorian, which I think was unexpected, was that literally is going 1 mile an hour, and that's what took out every single home on some of those smaller islands. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we are just not prepared as a country to deal with what we're actually seeing on the ground, that the things that are happening as a result of this accelerated warming. One of the things that I think is so critically important is really trying to identify that relationship between climate and health. So one of the things that we did right after Hurricane Harvey was we set up a health and housing registry with Rice University and with the city of Houston, because we recognize that we need to track this, how folks are doing 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years out from these events, if we ever hope to have a real understanding of the consequences, the long-term consequences, not just do you rebuild your house in the same area or this neighborhood, but do you have the same, did you develop cancer 10 years earlier than you might have otherwise because of some other exposure? Those kinds of things are all outstanding. So I think that's a great question. I would say on the whole, our country is not prepared to manage and deal with essentially what we have to be doing in terms of the adaptation piece. EDF is focused on mitigation, and we are doing some adaptation, but the country as a whole is obviously not been looking at this, I think, as much as we should be.
We read that in India there are many, many coal-fired power plants being constructed. Is there any sense of pressure within the Indian government or within Indian society to address the problems and to curtail in any way this expansion of coal-fired plants?
Well, yes, there is pressure. In fact, Environmental Defense Fund is organizing in India on climate and air issues and has been working in India for quite a while. We talked about mercury coming from those coal-fired power plants. Mercury doesn't just get into our fish, it actually gets into your rice and anything that is dependent on water. And that is a huge food staple for the world and certainly for India. So there's pressure. I think there are various competing interests to do the right thing versus continue business as usual. Politically, it's very tricky right now, but there's definitely more awareness of issues. I can't stand up here and say India's on the way to addressing this. China is actually much further along. Would you agree?
Yes, but I think there are some parallels, and thank you so much for the question, in that there are profound human health consequences from the coal-fired power plants, the massive sort of diesel, reliance on diesel in India, and it does threaten kind of the social fabric, and so the economics, as the economics change and clean energy becomes viable and outcompeting all of these coal plants and other forms of energy, and it becomes reliable as we pair it with storage, you know, together with the deep public concern and the threat to the social fabric. I think there's real opportunity to make progress in India that will save lives and reduce, you know, harmful climate pollution. And it's so important because the harms are so profound, and it's one of the biggest emitters in the world. It's really tremendously important.
And India is seeing enormous flood, waterborne disease issues, migration, loss of home, and that pressure will be unyielding on the government.
EDF isn't the only organization, environmental organization that I'm part of that seems to be talking about, we have to look at the system, right? And look at a sort of a high level, how all the pieces are working together. So I guess I'm curious, considering the scale of the task, what sort of alliances are you trying to develop with other large organizations? And I don't know, maybe saying like, okay, this is a big trend, you track that one, we'll track this one over here and share our findings just because there are only so many hours in the day kind of thing.
Well, I think Vicki should answer that in terms of all of the alliances that are made in court and in court cases. I will say that EDF tries very hard not to replicate what others are doing. I mean, there's a limited resource in all environmental organizations, so we have our specializations and our points of force, but our alliances and partnerships are absolutely critical.
Just in the context of the threats from kind of the current national policy sort of landscape, my experience day to day from the beginning is that the partnerships are extraordinary, that the environmental community has pulled together kind of arm in arm, unlike any time before, and it's so urgently needed because the threats are extensive and they're sustained, and we need all of our partners to be working together, and everyone is, and there's a real sense of all hands on deck and deep and abiding collaboration to do all we can to get through this really difficult period. It really requires all of us. You're right, we can't, no one person, no one organization can do this alone, and having the environmental community sort of just pull together in the way it has is crucial. It's also inspiring and heartening. And then you add in state attorneys general that are stepping up, you add in the public health and the medical community that are raising their voices, you add in all sorts of concerned Americans that are raising their voices and stepping up, and businesses, leading companies that are splintering. Environmental Defense President Fred Krupp just had a major op-ed in the Wall Street Journal talking about the 4 car companies, auto manufacturers, that have committed to achieve sustained deep reductions in climate pollution, notwithstanding the Trump administration's rollbacks.
And I think it's also interesting that in the last decade, organizations like Audubon and Nature Conservancy have also made climate pollution, global warming central to their missions.
And just as a scientist, one of the things that I think is so special and unique about EDF is our relationships within the academic and research communities. Mm-hmm. So I myself have worked very hard with local universities like Rice, Texas A&M, UT School of Public Health, and we build those networks, and they are embedded in everything that we do, because as much as this administration has degraded the science, as we've seen time and time again, the facts, do not lie. And so we have these very strong alliances that we build and foster within EDF, and that's one thing that I really cherish about our organization.
Yes, questions here?
I happen to be staying in New York
When-
City. Oh,
There we go.
I happen to be staying in New York City at this moment and on a very high floor. And I looked out the window in Hell's Kitchen. There's a big area of still low buildings. I didn't see one solar panel on a roof. Is solar panel that big in New York City?
I guess you're looking at me because I live in New York City. Well, you are right. There are very few still. This is a very old city with old infrastructure for the most part, and there are a lot of issues with holding up the weight of things like solar panels. Often these are excuses by owners and landlords. However, New York City and New York State have voted in enormously ambitious climate plans. So I think that, they are just leading the country. So those now actually have to happen, and we may see enormous change over the next decade or so, whether it's solar panels on all the roofs or wind energy coming in from offshore. But I think we are in a very, very big place of transition. Now we need the leadership to see that through.
I think what you're talking about is so encouraging, that you're going through businesses and academic and universities. What about lower down? How do you get to the people who follow the leadership, support the leadership, and don't believe in climate change? And I remember hearing once years ago, oh, God wouldn't let anything like this happen to us. I'm thinking back to Al Gore's film, which I thought was wonderful at the time. Are there activities aimed at the resistors?
Well, that's the basis of Mom's Clean Air Force, actually. A pure political ploy, because nobody wants to make their mother angry, right? So we go to Washington with our moms, with their children, and we spend a lot of time educating, talking to, helping people understand what these issues are. These are regular people who don't necessarily know anything about this, but they are incredibly worried about what's happening to the world that their children are growing up in, or they live near fracking facilities, they are seeing health issues coming out of that activity and out of the invisible emissions there. So we educate, we train, we let them be mothers, and these are sometimes situations where babies are not behaving in senators' offices, but we let them know very, very firmly that we demand action, something has to be done. EDF also has an enormous membership and an enormous membership list, and it is regularly regular emails, more than weekly, are sent out to the membership lists. We collect signatures on petitions that are delivered to lawmakers or to the EPA. So again, in the last 10 years, I think there's been a huge change in that. When I started Moms, I felt like after that Al Gore film, which was deeply disturbing and inspiring to me, I felt like scientists were talking to scientists and economists were talking to economists, and nobody was talking to regular people about like why you need to care, why you should be lying awake at night. And that's what we're trying to do day after day after day.
Just to add, and thank you so much for that question. Just yesterday, there was polling released about sort of the views of voters in Texas in anticipation of tonight's debate. And the vast majority of voters in Texas across the spectrum support clean energy and support climate action. There was a poll earlier in September, in advance of the CNN sort of special on climate change that indicated that Democratic voters, the top 3 issues for Democratic voters is healthcare, climate change, and gun control. There's never been a time before where we've seen this much support for action. And I think there's a couple of factors. One is people are unfortunately experiencing the harm and seeing the harm. And that's changing how people think, whether you're in North Carolina or Houston or Florida. You're living and you're seeing kind of the real world harms of climate change, and that's changing, I think, how people think about it. And there's also then the economic benefits, the economic opportunities. There are farm families in the Midwest and in parts of the Intermountain West that are keeping their farms and their family because they're hosting wind turbines and they're receiving a lease payment. And that is what is the difference in them either keeping or losing their family farm. There is a steel manufacturing facility in a manufacturing town that employs 1,000 people that just renegotiated its long-term contract because the single biggest cost it has is energy, single biggest cost. And it had been reliant on coal-based power forever. And they just negotiated a long-term 30-year contract for utility-scale solar because it's out-competing the coal. People are now starting to see the tangible sort of economic benefits to them as we make this crucial and urgent transition to clean energy. And just, I think Mom's Clean Air Force is so unusual and so powerful in helping us to kind of transcend the divide, because it is all about bringing together Christian conservative moms, military moms, Latina moms, moms in red and purple and blue America who are united by one thing, and that is clean air for their kids. And that transcends so much, and that is so powerful. So we need more of that.
That was a good question. I always like to say that God gave us scientists. So we know what we can do to solve these issues.
But your voices really do matter. Look what just happened in Ohio, one of the worst energy policies ever voted in by any state in the country because of multi-millions upon millions of dollars spent by the fossil fuel industry trying to keep renewable energy out of the state. So we can't let up, can't take for granted that we are on the right path. We're nowhere near far down enough. Yes?
Vicki, you talked about some really encouraging progress with auto companies and with utilities, and I wonder if you could speak to what is happening with agriculture in terms of their participation in moving forward and things that they can do.
There's increasing importance of agriculture being, I think, part of the solutions in solving the climate crisis. And one of the things that Environmental Defense Fund does is we come at that from a number of different ways. And thanks so much, Marcia, to your vision and your leadership and forging this foundation. One is working directly with farmers, and working directly with farmers to really test the proposition and to prove the proposition that acting on climate is not a threat, it's an opportunity for farmers. And so energy costs are high for farmers. Fertilizer is expensive if you're a farmer. All of these really critical inputs into farming practices have climate impacts. And if we can demonstrate that there are ways in which you can farm and achieve the same or better yields and reduce your costs, that's a really important model. And it's a big part of what the team of staff at Environmental Defense Fund, again, Marcia, thanks to your vision and your leadership, have been doing, and I think, you know, demonstrating with success. One of, I think, the opportunities for us that we're going to really need help working through is, as a number of states are taking action and putting in place these vital science-based climate pollution reduction goals, how do we make sure that the models that we're creating in places like Colorado and North Carolina and California demonstrate that climate action can be good for farmers? And I think we have a lot of work to do. It's going to be super important that the models that are happening at the state and local level are work for farmers.
The question at the back.
Much of our discussion tonight has been about what can be done at the state and local level. I just wonder, what is EDF doing in terms of state and local lobbying? How many people do you have committed to that, and what are they doing?
So there's a Environmental Defense Action Fund, is a sister organization of Environmental Defense Fund that does C4 lobbying. And in the 2018 election, focused increasingly at major sort of state races, and that includes gubernatorial races, state legislative races, and notably state attorneys general races. Its Environmental Defense Action Fund has grown. It's really important as we think about 2020, we have a defining moment in ensuring that Environmental Defense Action Fund and other C4 organizations are fully engaged in really one of the most important elections of our lives.
Are you working also with companies that are developing carbon sequestration programs?
We're doing a little of that in Texas because obviously we have a lot of opportunity there. And so some of our work with Scott Anderson and the clean energy team has been focused on trying to identify those solutions. In Texas, it's particularly important because we need some sort of answer for the fossil fuel industry. It's not that I think EDF's position is we're against fossil fuels, we're against fossil fuel pollution. And so what can we do to transition to get to that net zero state that we need to have to address the crisis? That's a great question.
Yeah, what we're really hoping is that Silicon Valley is all over this and that the government will fund much more research into innovative technology, because we need an all-out effort to find all kinds of solutions. It is all hands on deck and all engineering on deck. Right here.
Thanks. Byron Fay. Good question about climate litigation. Given there's an increasingly strong connection, it seems, between particulate emissions from coal, oil and gas and health issues, is there any thought about having class action lawsuits against some of these major companies, potentially collectively for that harm? Or is it just too hard to prove the causation for that to be feasible?
So there are, and thank you, Byron, for the question. There are a number of class action lawsuits that have been filed and are in various stages in the courts, and they involve both kind of localized contaminants and also climate pollution. There are a number of cases that have been brought against the oil and gas industry, and some time ago, a major set of cases against coal-fired power. The Supreme Court held in the case against the coal-fired power companies that because there is the authority and at the time action to address climate pollution from the power sector under the Clean Air Act, which enables action addressing climate pollution, that the federal common law claims were displaced. It expressly did not address whether the state common law claims were displaced. And so all of these really important cases that are moving forward are based on important and innovative state law claims. There's a lot of debate about the strength of these cases, and a lot of experts who think they're much stronger than they were 10 years ago, because in the last 10 years, 10, 15 years, there's been evidence that some of these companies knew and were aware of the climate harms, and because the science has become so much stronger in identifying sort of the connections between climate pollution and weather events that are supercharged are really, on steroids due to the massive climate pollution we've put into the system.
And there's also the children's lawsuit.
Ilse Melamed. One of my concerns is public awareness. I think we have a long way to go. Have you ever thought of publishing lists like the best 500 and the worst 500 in industry? And how would you rate Amazon?
Amazon.
See your answer.
I think I'm very sensitive to that need, I think, to broaden the conversation to include folks who have not been a part of it. I also think that we need new messengers. I think there's only so many times that I can say, I tell my 3-year-old, stop doing this stuff, and then she never does it, but then dad comes in and says, stop doing that, and she'll stop. And then, so I think sometimes it can be about who is sharing the message. One of the things that we're doing in Texas is we've actually have an extensive collaboration with high schools along the Houston Ship Channel. And we are building into their daily schedules classes about environmental science, because those courses have not traditionally been given at the high school level. And these are literally the communities that are on the front line of some of the climate impacts. And it's not just, we're going to come in and bring some speakers and you'll sit and listen. It's today we're going to have CPR training because air pollution increases your risk of having a heart attack. You live in a community with a higher concentration of particulate matter than some of the other communities around Houston. So this is a valuable skill for you to have in your community. And in that way, we're trying to connect the data points and to communicate that there are real tangible consequences of what we're doing in terms of just not having this uncontrolled climate pollution. So that's one of the things. How I would rate Amazon, I do some work on the transportation side. I think one of the biggest issues that Amazon has to address is, you know, you can order a pair of socks and have them delivered on a Sunday. You know, something that you don't necessarily maybe need that particular day, but you can get it. And so one of the things that I think, at least with our partnership with Walmart and some of the big box retailers, they've been focused on what can we offer different choices to consumers so that they can make the decision about whether they get something in the, you know, within the hour, or is this something that they can bring on a regular delivery day, so that there's not the associated increase in the climate pollution. And then obviously I think addressing some of the emissions associated with those systems, and that goes all the way back to you know, the transportation network, which includes ships, it includes cargo handling equipment, it includes trucks. That, you know, the average port has thousands of trucks that come in and out every single day at those facilities, and there are communities that are around those facilities, and those are the dirtiest, most polluting trucks we have on the planet. So, you know, trying to figure out ways to address the system as a whole, I think, is one of the critical things that we're trying to do.
One of the things I love about EDF is that there are actually people there who think of things like this. How can we change the UPS trucking system so that it makes those trucks make only right turns, so that they're not idling as they're waiting for traffic, so that they have to cross and take left turns, totally rearranging the trucking system and cutting enormous, enormous amounts of pollution out of the air. And this isn't the sexiest stuff that you can think of, but it's actually something that works at a huge scale.
I don't mean to get greedy, but I was wondering about flooding. And I read in The Economist that there are, just in New York City, 75,000 buildings that are basically in a floodplain. We're up there with Houston, and but we don't know it. And the other thing is that unlike Canada, we keep paying flood claims. You know, that there are tens of thousands of properties that flood every couple of years, and FEMA keeps paying out money instead of, the Canadians basically give you $250,000 or whatever it is and say, that's it. You know, next time you move. And if you don't, that's your problem. And I'm just wondering, because I think the flood insurance system in this country is always on the verge of bankruptcy. And I'm wondering if EDF is, in its lobbying arm elsewhere, is trying to do anything to reform that.
I would say that one of the things that we're trying to do with facilities specifically is we would like to see the climate risk that they pose incorporated into their insurance premiums. So if they have a poor environmental record, if they have OSHA violations, if they have emission events outside of their permitted allotment, that factors into what kind of premium that they have to pay. A lot of the big industrial facilities, their premiums are tens of millions of dollars. And we're actually working with a private sector company called Adapt Ready. This is actually a former Climate Corps, EDF Climate Corps fellow who started this company. And the role that she has is to try to find ways that we can come up with a risk index for things like climate. One of the things that's been so important to Houston, if you've been following the series of explosions that we've had just in the last couple of years, those explosions don't just impact that particular facility. It's all the downstream facilities that rely on the products that one facility might have been the only manufacturer of a particular compound. So there are important systemic things that occur, yes, as a result. So, yes, we are thinking of those things. I think, I mean, your point on the flooding is, I think, very important. One of the things that I find so disheartening, and I think this is generally true across most things, but a lot of our incentives, I think, are misaligned. And for example, when they did the analysis, the financial analysis of the whole the toll that Harvey would have on Houston, there actually ends up being a net benefit to Houston in terms of dollars because of the massive amount of investment, the builders that come in, the new cars that get purchased. But those investments are happening to the very few, folks who can afford it. You don't hear about the increase in the homeless population that's now, that will be on the streets of Houston. The folks who are now don't have a job because they don't have a car because it flooded. So, those are the kinds of things that I think are extraordinarily difficult to try to address. But we are working and are trying to figure out how can we better align what's happening on the ground with where we need to be in terms of planning. I think that's a great point.
We have time for one more. Yes, okay.
And I have a sister who lives in Kingwood, Texas. She had to live on her second floor for a while after they get the first floor. But my question has to do with climate change and message, because most people who are going to decide the election don't read the New York Times, the Washington Post, or EDF. And the question is, how do you get the message to the people in the states where these people live who will decide who the next president is? And a lot of these places, you have to get the message across, but you can't use the word climate change. How do you make sure that they understand it's important to them?
Go ahead, Vicki.
Again, the messengers are really important. The words we use are crucial. In the last few months, we've seen unprecedented flooding in parts of the Midwest, and as people are afflicted by these extreme weather events, that starts to change their perceptions, even if they don't call it climate change. They understand that something is different, and something is wrong. All of the polling indicates that perception, whether you're a Republican or an independent or a Democrat, is changing largely across the board. We're also seeing a lot of really young Republicans that are deeply, profoundly concerned about climate change. And I think as they all also begin raising their voice and organizing, that too will have a really tremendous impact. And again, in combination with the solutions that deliver real value and real benefits to people's lives. And we're at that transition where, we used to talk about clean energy as, it's a burden, right? Clean energy is an opportunity in America, all parts of America. Wind and utility scale solar and electric vehicles, are all, either out-competing other forms or will soon be or well on the pathway to do that. And people are starting to see real tangible benefits. They're seeing manufacturing facilities in their rural communities for wind turbines. They're seeing jobs that are being created and economic opportunity that extends to them, and that's got to be an important part of it. We've got to make sure that we really address the urban and the rural divide in our country, and that no one is left behind, that we're all in this together. But I think part of it is just as people see the harms and as all sorts of voices raise their concerns. And We're seeing it in Congress. You know, for the first time in 10 years, there are Republican members of Congress that are sponsoring, crafting, leading climate legislation, and that's part of the sea change.
So there are signs of hope, but there's an enormous amount of work to do. We will be doing that. Thank you to all of you for supporting that work.